Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gail Dines. She is Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies at Wheelock College. She specializes in the study of pornography, and she's also the CEO of Culture Reframed, a nonprofit built to build resilience and resistance in kids to pornography and hypersexualized media. And today we're focusing mostly on her book, Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality. So, Dr. Dines, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure
Thank
to
you
have you
for
on.
inviting me. It's a pleasure. Yes.
Okay, so let me start by asking you, is there any particular definition of pornography? Would you define pornography in any specific way, or is it one of those things that we know when we see it, or we can identify it when we see it, but it's really hard to define?
No, it's not. First of all, considering you've got a multi-billion-dollar industry called pornography, if they produce pornography, which is what they're out for, then I'm happy to go with their definition. It's like when you're discussing any other industry like fast food, you're not asked to define it. You look at the industry and you see what the product is. But as we get talking, we will talk about how at the core of pornography is the debasement and dehumanization of women. That's what makes porn porn. So I don't really get into definitional issues because it doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't get into that for any other industry. Because, the car industry, as I said, makes cars. You don't talk about it has an engine and a steering wheel and this, you look at the industry and you see what they produce.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of pornography, particularly in the US? Because there are bits that might be very interesting here for us to explore, particularly how it's changed over the course of the last few decades, particularly with the introduction of the internet and all of the different kinds of media we have nowadays.
So I would say that if you want to look at the modern day pornography industry, you have to start with Playboy. And the reason for that is that Playboy really mainstreamed pornography. It took it out of the back streets and seedy corners and put it on the coffee tables of often middle-class white men. Now, what was interesting about that was this was a very conservative time during the 50s in the US. And so the question is, how did a man, Hugh Hefner, manage to build an empire on pornography in what was a conservative time? And one of the things he did that was very clever was he really built a magazine that spoke to the aspirations of the up-and-coming white middle-class man who had, for the first time, really disposable income. And so you had this new sort of middle class. And remember, a lot of them were born during the Depression and the war, and they were very frugal. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but they didn't know how to spend money at that point because you saved money. So what he really produced was a magazine that was based upon teaching these men what consumption looked like. You'd have whole articles on what clothes to wear, what desks to buy, what to eat. And of course, what really attracted these men was the centerfolds and the images. He said, people said, excuse me, I only read pornography for the articles. Well, that's ridiculous. I felt like writing to them once in pornography and saying, no one's looking at the pictures. Of course, it was the pictures that really made it popular. But he did it in a way that was sort of surrounded by a middle-class lifestyle. They had very well-known writers in there. And they once said that if they took the pictures out of Playboy, Playboy would die like a dead dog. And I would say if you took the articles out of Playboy, it would die because you wouldn't have a cover. You needed a cover to say, why did you have these images of women on, out there in the public? So he sort of really introduced softcore, made it mainstream. Then in the 60s, Penthouse came in. And the goal was for Penthouse, Bob Guccione, who'd been in it publishing in England was to come to the US and to really make it, sort of really make Penthouse the #1 pornography magazine. However, there was a war between Playboy and Penthouse of who could produce the most explicit images. And in the end, Penthouse really lost the war. And the reason is their images were too explicit for advertisers. Because remember, this is how you make money in the media. So in those days. So what he did was, not only did he sexualize, not only did he commodify sexuality, this is Hugh Hefner, he sexualized commodities and said, if you consume at the level that we tell you to in Playboy, then you can get these women who are centerfolds and all the other images. So he actually understood not to cross a line. So because the advertisers would then, and they did start, by the way, at some point when there was a battle between Playboy and Penthouse to pull some of the advertisements because the images were too explicit. In the end, Playboy won because they stopped producing such explicit images as Penthouse, and Penthouse never really found its feet. But watching this from the sidelines was a strip club owner from Ohio called Larry Flint. And he came in the 70s with Hustler. And he became he established the hardcore end of pornography. So you had Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler. And what they did, these three men, is they socialized and groomed the American public to accept more pornography as a kind of mainstream image. So that really went on for many years. Then you had videos, etc. But what really sort of made Playboy the sex education of the present day and the wallpaper of young people's lives was the internet. And when the internet became domesticated in 2000, it made pornography what one scholar has called affordable, anonymous, and accessible. You didn't have to leave the home. You didn't have to go into these theatres. You didn't have to go to the local porn CD shop. So really what happened is the internet, and the internet allowed to build pornography. But I also want to say that the pornography helped construct the internet. The pornography is always at the head of technology. It's where a lot of R&D money comes from. And so a lot of the things like you see, like pop-ups, pop-downs, paywalls, all of these things, was actually introduced by the porn industry. So that's what got us to 2000. And what was interesting as someone who was watching what was going on was I was pretty astounded by the degree to which the pornography on the internet became hardcore so quickly. I mean, it literally went from, semi-softcore to semi-hardcore to absolute hardcore, which is in Pornland I call gonzo. But I wrote Pornland in 2008, 2009, and that's what the industry was calling it. It's no longer called gonzo because mainstream porn is hardcore. It's very, very hard to find anything on the internet, especially for free, that's not hardcore. So in the beginning, between about 2000 and 2007, anyone with a camcorder could get a set a porn site going, make money. And then in 2007, a man called Fabian Thyman, who was an IT specialist, came in and he developed the free porn tube sites, and very much like YouTube. And that's when porn really took off. You didn't need a credit card. Most of the stuff was free and it was hardcore. So if you think about your average kid or young male going to pornography, they're going to go to a site that's free and accessible. They're not going to start hunting through the millions of sites to find softcore. So again, Pornhub, Fabian Thyman, who was the head of MindGeek, that's the company that he founded, just saturated the internet with hardcore porn. And I mean, I think all of us who research pornography from a critical stance was shocked by the degree to which it became so hardcore so quickly. And in fact, if you would have told me 30 odd years ago, that you would have hardcore pornography up there, accessible to anybody for free, I would have said, no, that's not going to happen. You know, the culture's not going to sit back. Politicians aren't going to sit back and let that happen. But I would have been wrong.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand it correctly, and the way you presented how pornography changed over the course of the past few decades, particularly in the US, but now worldwide, the two main changes that occurred, and probably the ones that worry you the most, have to do with the fact that over time, at least in your understanding, it became increasingly hardcore, and it's also more easily available, and even more so for children and adolescents, right?
And mainstream. It's now become the wallpaper of their lives. It's the mainstream. Not only, you know, if it was hardcore and only a few people watched it, few men, because it's mainly men who were consumers, it would be a problem, but not to the degree that it is. That it's so mainstreamed in our lives that it's a lot of kids actually see it as just another social media site, not even pornography.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean by phrases, words, or terms like women being demeaned and debased in hardcore pornography? What does that mean exactly? And I want to ask you that because there are people out there that when they hear these kinds of words, they might reply to it with something like, or something along the lines of, "Oh, you're just moralizing things." So,
yeah, no, this is not a moral issue. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I am progressive, left wing, I mean, on the left. So this is not about a moral issue. This is about a harms issue. And the issue really becomes what happens in a culture where those images themselves become the blueprint for all other forms of media. Yeah. What happens there? So, and if you look at Pornhub, YouPorn, Xporn, you will see that the acts are based on cruelty and body punishing acts where she's, can I speak freely about what's in pornography?
Yeah, sure.
You see a lot of gagging where the woman is gagged with a penis so far down her throat that she can't breathe. And as she's choking, the male porn performer is actually grabbing her head and pulling it closer so she chokes even more. I've seen scenes where she even vomits, and they keep those in. Something that's become very worrisome and very popular lately is strangulation. And that we're finding from studies. There was a recent study that's asked incoming young women into college when was about their last sexual experience, not their entire sexual experience, their last, and 1 in 3 was strangled, they said. Now, where does this come from? And remember, this can be fatal because you're cutting off the air to the brain, which can cause all sorts of brain damage. Even if you don't kill her, you can cause a lot of problems, stroke, heart attacks, things like this. So you've got a lot of strangulation. A lot of very hardcore anal sex where the goal is to make it hurt, to make it really be something that she can't tolerate. And if you sometimes go on the porn discussion boards, you'll get questions like a thread like, can someone point me to a porn movie where the bitch can no longer stand it? And then you'll get hundreds of responses on these sites saying, go to this movie at 3 minutes, 23 seconds, and you see a breakdown. So the more cruel it is, the more it's drawing on, more it draws consumers. So it's really based on that. There's a lot of spitting in a face, especially ejaculation on the face. I mean, anything from 1, 2, 3, 4 men are ejaculating on a face. And in a documentary called, in a documentary, they actually interviewed a pornographer, and he said, they asked him, why do they actually ejaculate on a woman's face? And he said, it's like a dog pissing on a lamppost. It's claiming your own territory. So, I mean, your average porn movie is anything from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys basically penetrating a woman orally, anally, vaginally, sometimes 2 penises in the mouth, 2 in the anus, 2 in the vagina, which just imagine what that does to the body, because this is a real human being and she has bodily limits. And what you see is they take her to the extreme, and it is that extreme that has become mainstream, and that is basically what has made pornography so popular.
So about that, let me just ask you one thing. You mentioned a lot of extreme acts there, but what if at least some of them, I'm not saying all of them, but if some of them are done consensually? Because of course, for most people, that is something that they wouldn't engage in sexually because they consider it to be extreme. But there are a tiny number of people, like people, for example, who practice BDSM, that are into those kinds of acts.
Which is linked to pornography, by the way. You can't take BDSM away from pornography. Pornography has also mainstreamed BDSM. It doesn't mean it invented it, but it mainstreamed it. Look, the question is, you can never know if it's consensual. That's the first thing. We don't know, because we don't know what contracts they sign, the women, and we don't know under what conditions. What we do know is pornography is where sexism, racism, capitalism, and colonialism intersect for the women, because most of the women in pornography are poor and desperate. So you don't get your average graduate from Harvard or Yale or Princeton or whatever lining up to do pornography. It's mainly poor women from poor countries. So anything where there's coercion, it can be economic coercion. It can be coercion through a pimp. It can be coercion through being a refugee from wars. So we don't know. And also the sites don't check. The sites don't check. They say they look at the contracts, but you don't know under what conditions. So my assumption is that that there's so few women who really consent. And when you consent, you have to have other options in life. Pornography can't be the only way to put food on the table. So I would say, given what we know about the women in pornography, they've also, by the way, are disproportionately victims of child sexual abuse prior to being in pornography. When you know those conditions, then you have to say, basically, that consent is more complicated than what they're saying.
And aren't there particular cases? I'm not sure what percentage of cases this would correspond to, but aren't there cases of child pornography as well, or pornography done with underage people?
Oh, yeah. Pornhub is full of it. They're being sued right now. There's cases going forward. And I mean, and I spend quite a bit of time on Pornhub. So, I mean, I've seen very young looking girls. I mean, they barely look pubescent. So yes, it's sort of full of those images as well. And it's full of trafficked women as well, women who've been trafficked into the porn industry by the pimps. So the industry is built on, as I said, racism, sexism, colonialism, capitalism, all. And the more you fall into those categories, the more likely you are to be exploited. So any industry that's built on the economic exploitation is suspect to begin with. And that's true of all industries, but especially the porn industry, where the actual acts of violence against her are so body punishing and cruel, and also cause post-traumatic stress disorder, all sorts of bodily injuries, especially anal prolapses, where the anuses drop out through hardcore anal sex, chlamydia of the eye, gonorrhea of the throat. I mean, these are you don't hear other people apart from prostituted women having those kinds of on-the-job diseases, or their body being treated in such a way. I mean, I remember once when I was having some blood drawn, it had a big sign up: if you come into contact with bodily fluids, this was in a healthcare facility, call this number immediately. And as I sat there, I thought, could you imagine if the porn industry had to abide by that? They'd be on the phone all the time. I mean, think of all the bodily fluids that are all over the porn set: urine, blood, feces, saliva, ejaculate. Just think what's actually there. And, we're meant to have, where's OSHA, which is the actual, in America, responsible for health and safety in the workplace? Nobody seems to care about pornography. And I would say it's because it's mainly women who are the victims.
But when it comes to STI specifically, I hear lots of times that nowadays, particularly the big companies, they require their actors to do blood work every 15 days or something like
Yeah,
that.
I've got a lot of it actually, and this is straight from the porn industry. I can't say who it is, but I was in conversation with one of the people who actually do those tests, and he said a lot of them change their tests because they want to work, and they change their test if they're HIV positive or they've got some sort of disease. And again, where there's so many hundreds of thousands of women in the porn industry and from all over the world. Remember, we're not talking now just about LA and the Valley. We're talking about all over the world. How are you going to check all those women? How are you going to keep, any documentation about that? So that's a myth.
And what do you make of porn that is labeled as feminist? Like, for example, there's a director/producer from Sweden called Erika Lust, and she creates porn that she labels as feminist, that is more targeted toward the female audience and depicts sex in more, I don't know, romantic, emotionally involved ways.
That's not Eric. I've seen a lot of Erika Lust's work. And her stuff looks a lot like mainstream hardcore pornography. What Erika Lust is an excellent businesswoman. She has created, as has some of those other so-called feminist pornographers, a great niche market. And what you find is more woke men will go there because they don't want to think they're actually supporting the mainstream porn industry. So, I mean, and if pornography works by virtue of degradation and debasement of women, the first rule of feminism is do no harm to women. So I don't see that as feminist pornography. I see it as a niche market of the mainstream porn industry.
And of course, in your work, you talk a lot about some of the supposed psychological effects of porn. So what are the main ones you would point to, and what is the evidence to support
Well,
them?
it's not just my work. We're talking now about 30 to 40 years of empirical research by psychologists, sociologists, multiple disciplines coming together. And what they found for boys and men is that the more pornography they watch, the more they have anxiety, depression, the more likely they are to act out the violence that they see, the more likely their sexual scripts are going to be formed by pornography, the more likely their sexual templates are going to be formed by pornography, the less likely they are to have empathy for rape victims. They often, if they get into habitual use, they withdraw from life completely and become totally addicted to their pornography. Now, that's a smaller percentage, I want to be clear, but it is growing. Where every time we speak at Culture Reframed and we go out and give lectures and talk about it, we hear from frontline medical experts about the degree to which pornography is now becoming a problem, even with kids, in terms of addiction. And it's a substance, unlike other forms of addictive substances, you can't really detox from this because the images are in your head. You formed your sexual template around this. What arouses you. And also one of the things we found is that men who are deep into pornography actually prefer pornography over actual sex with real human beings. Because, pornography is so hardcore that so few women will do those acts, that in fact, asking a male whose sexual template or script has been formed by pornography to go and have actual sex is like asking a whiskey drinker to go back to beer. It's boring. They get very desensitized to the violence, so they're looking for more and more images of violence.
So at a certain point there, you mentioned porn addiction. So let me just ask you, because I've had on the show a neuroscientist who does work on porn, Dr. Nicole Prozzi,
Yeah, I know.
and one of the things that we talked about is exactly porn addiction. And she told me that according to her studies and the studies of other people, people who tend to report that they suffer from porn addiction the most tend to be religious people who have been brought up with moral values against pornography use. What do you make of that?
I'd say that her studies are against the grain of the weight of the studies about addiction, right? I mean, when you're in any science, you don't go by one study or two studies. You go by the weight of the evidence. And Nicole Prouse's work constantly stands outside the weight of the evidence. So I don't feel they carry much weight given the enormity of the evidence that doesn't show that to be true. That in fact, becoming addicted to porn is much more likely to be for men who are on the spectrum, for people who've gone through the foster care system, men with ADHD. I mean, there's other factors that make you more susceptible to becoming an addict. Religion has not been found to be one of them.
Okay, so do you also make claims about a relationship between pornography consumption and increase in sexual aggression or sexual violence?
Well, not I do, but I draw it from the research, of course.
Mm,
And what we found in longitudinal studies, which remember
okay.
that's causation, not correlation, is that boys who excuse me, and men who watch pornography are more likely to act out the violent acts. Yes, that's what the research is showing. And again, we have an enormous amount of research to show this. It's not Gail Dines saying this, right? It's looking at what the research says.
But about that, isn't it also true that over time, I mean, over the course of the decades, porn consumption has been increasing, but at the same time, if you look at sexual violence, it has been decreasing. And so, at least just looking at those two factors, it seems that there would be a negative correlation between porn consumption and sexual
Yeah, that's called the
violence.
cathartic effect, that if you watch porn, you won't go out and do violence. Again, there's no research to show that. In fact, the statistics do not suggest that violence against women is decreasing. What we do know is less women are reporting. When we speak, again, we work a lot in the medical world. And when you listen to those who are on the front lines, most of the women who have been violated, raped, hurt in some way do not report it because they can't go, they feel that they're going to get degraded yet again through the justice system. So, no, I mean, again, that study, 1 in 3 girls had been strangled in their last sexual, and young women had been strangled in their last sexual experience. That wouldn't get noted down as violence. So there's all types of violence now that are not noted down. So, I mean, this is what makes really drawing sort of assumptions about this very difficult, is that there's new types of violence which are not being defined as violence by the women and girls who themselves are being groomed by the porn industry to expect this.
Mhm. There's also another thing that came to my mind now. A few years ago, I read on the news that I think it was in the UK, there was an increase recently of women asked to perform anal sex by their partners. And I think that it was probably influenced also by pornography in that specific case. Of course, I'm not saying that's necessarily a case of violence, but a case of changing expectations when it comes to sex.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. It is changing expectations of what is to do. And also, we know a lot of women report men doing anal sex on them without asking and being hurt by this. Again, the medical profession talk about a lot of anal ruptures, a lot of harm done to women anally. And you think about it, again, porn didn't invent anal sex. What it did is it basically normalized it to the point that many men do expect anal, as do women, because they too, have been influenced by the porn industry.
Yes, and in that specific case, the expectations, it's not just that men expect anal sex to be more available, but also women have the expectation that they have to perform anal sex to please their partner.
Plus everything else, you see.
Yeah.
And what we found, there's not many studies done on how women respond to pornography, but there's a few. And what they find is that a lot of women go to pornography not to masturbate, but to see what men want of them so that they can then perform that. And actually it's scaring them. It scares them to see those. And it would be scary. I mean, I think myself when I was younger, if I would have seen that, I think who wants to have sex after that when you're watching it? But they do perform this because they think it is expected of them and that this is what they should be doing.
Mm-hmm. So let me also ask you, because earlier you described some of the most extreme acts that we can see
mainstream. Those were mainstream. Those were not. I don't go into extreme areas now.
Okay. So the extreme acts that we see in mainstream porn, but what about the kinds of stories that we usually see presented in porn movies? Do you think that that's also important to explore?
There's very few porn movies that have stories to them. Most of them are just clips of sex act after violent sex act after violent sex act. The days of, the pizza delivery man coming to the door and then they end up having sex, those belong in the 1990s and earlier. They're not there now. Most of it does not have a storyline. It's just sex scene after sex scene after sex scene.
And many times when I hear you and other people who have the same approach to pornography talk about pornography, you use words like sexual exploitation. What does exploitation mean in this particular context?
Well, it means taking a human being, commodifying them, destroying their humanity, selling them out, making them disposable, putting them through all kinds of violence, both physically and mental. And it's the loss of power over that person. That's what exploitation is when that person loses power and people come in and either exploit them when they've lost power through poverty or whatever, or groom them into becoming performers in the sex industry. And the sex industry is a revolving door. You go to pornography, you go to strip clubs, you end up being prostituted, you go to brothels. Very much the same women are going through this revolving door.
Mm-hmm. And so those are the different kinds of ways, and I would imagine that you would also add things like sex trafficking, the different kinds of ways that women in the porn industry can be exploited.
The whole sex industry, right? And that includes OnlyFans, where women are being sexually exploited in OnlyFans. I mean, often the media talk about, this woman became a millionaire through OnlyFans, and you get those stories. Those are very, very rare. The average woman on OnlyFans makes about $180 a month, which is not enough to put food on the table. A lot of them are pimped into it. Again, a lot of them have the same background as women in pornography, wanting to make money because they can't make it in other ways. So I'm talking about the entire sex industry is an exploitation of what it means to be human. And these women are systematically dehumanized in the sex industry. And in fact, it's not an accident, because the more you dehumanize her, the more you destroy her sense of self, the more likely she is to be compliant. And that's taken as misunderstood as consent.
It's interesting that you mentioned platforms like OnlyFans, because I was actually going to ask you, because I had this idea that at least in those sorts of platforms, since it is, I mean, the users, the creators that create their own content and put it out there, that it would be more independently done. And so some of the issues that perhaps we see in the porn industry, we wouldn't see there.
Well, first of all, we don't know how independently done it is, if these are not women who have pimps who are putting them on OnlyFans. And secondly, you know, OnlyFans takes 20% of the woman's earnings. So OnlyFans is actually a pimp site. It pimps out women. And this pimp site is very interesting because so few women make much money. They offer that if you bring in your friends to OnlyFans, you get a percentage of what she makes. So you're taking women, you're pimping them out, and then you're asking them to become pimps by bringing in other women. So it's a real, you know, sort of kind of pimp platform that really is becoming more encased in the porn industry. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of money to be made for the platforms, and that some of the men are desensitized through pornography and want what they think is a girlfriend experience or some kind of interaction with a real human being. But of course, it's all about commodification of the human being and of the woman and commodification of sex.
And what do you make of women? I'm focusing mostly on women here. We can also talk about the men, of course, but women who work in the porn industry and say or claim that they like it, they want to do it, and even when it comes to the more extreme sins, they're doing it consensually. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, there might be a few women like that. I wouldn't say no, but remember, these women work in the industry, right? You're not going to say, I'm exploited, I hate it, this is terrible, because you're never going to work in the industry again. So don't ask a woman who's in the industry to talk about what's going on. It's like asking someone at a, you know, sweatshop how they feel about their job with their manager standing next to them. You're not going to get the truth. And also, psychologically, if she's in the industry, she's really going to have to psychologically believe that, because otherwise she would absolutely crash and burn. Having to do the violence, having to experience that violence on a daily basis is just too much to admit what's happening to your body. And we work and have spoken to a lot of women who've been out of the industry for many years, and they say the same thing. When I was in it, I would have said the same thing. It's only now I'm out of it and that I can sort of process what's happened to me that I now realize what was going on.
So do you think that perhaps to a certain extent they would be rationalizing things as a sort of defense mechanism?
Yes, partly yes. And partly because if you want to work in the industry, that's the story you have to give. But I mean...
No, I was just going to say that actually some of those cases of people who only after they abandon the porn industry that they come out and tell about how they were exploited or they felt exploited. There are people out there like, for example, Lana Rhoades, Mia Khalifa, that now talk about their experiences and get some backlash from people that are part of the porn industry.
A lot of backlash. I mean, even Jenna Jameson's book, How to Make Love Like a Porn Star, I mean, which was a bestseller. I mean, if you read between the lines, she talks about what really goes on. I mean, you know, she's trying to sell porn on one, and she's come out and talked about that, as have many women afterwards. But what's interesting is many women in the porn industry, once they're out, they don't become public figures. And the reason for that is, first of all, they're scared of the porn industry and what they'll do to them. And secondly, they feel so exposed because their images are everywhere. You know, you put an image up on Pornhub and it spreads across the porn sites. So they feel like they've never left the porn industry because your images are up there. And where are you going to go? How are you going to get them taken down? And even if you do try to get them taken down, they pop up again somewhere else. So you're talking about a very vulnerable group of women who, you know, are scared that their kids are going to find it, their kids' friends, their next door neighbor, all of that.
Yes, something that I find really, I mean, unfortunate to say the least, probably exploitative as well, and has been reported by, again, Lena Rhodes, Mia Khalifa, and other people like that, is that it seems that the content they produced or contributed to is owned by the porn companies, and now even after they left the industry and they would like for that content to be wiped off the internet, they can't. Right.
No, I mean, there's ways you can try, but I mean, very few have success. Very few. And it's almost impossible given the way in which they go viral and they end up on different. I mean, you often see when you sort of look at porn sites, the same images across porn sites. Everyone's pirating from everybody else.
Yeah. And so what would you say are perhaps some of the best solutions or potential solutions to deal with these issues surrounding the porn industry?
Well, regulation. It's the most, I would say it's the largest multi-billion-dollar a year above ground industry that is completely deregulated. And so we need to start thinking about regulation. They need to follow work practices. I mean, that if there was had to follow the same work practices as other companies, that would close them down immediately because of all the, again, the bodily fluids, the harms done. Also, we need regulation to stop kids having access to it. And that's called age verification, which is taken off in many countries and is also taking off now in the United States, where you have to have a third party verify that anyone who wants to go on a porn site is 18 or above. The porn industry is pushing back, of course, because any regulation, like all capitalist industries, they fight regulation. No industry wants regulation. They fight it tooth and nail. And so the porn industry has been fighting that. And, when you think they're fighting the fact that what we're saying is that anyone under 18 shouldn't have access, you just see how morally bankrupt they've become. Because before pornography went on the internet and you had a bricks and mortar shop, anyone under 18 wasn't allowed in anyway. You had to show ID to get there. So all we're saying there is take it back to how it used to be before the internet took over the porn industry. I think class action suits of women who've been harmed by the porn industry going after the pornographers. Because in the United States, where you have civil law, different to criminal law, that would if you kept coming at them with the suits from parents whose kids have been harmed, from men who'd been harmed, from women who'd been harmed in it, both through the sex industry and what happened to them afterwards, you could just slowly chip away quite heavily at the profits. And that's what this is about. The porn industry is not there to make us have more liberated sex lives. The porn industry is there to make money. Just like the fast food industry isn't there to make sure we improve our diet. And really, pornography is to sex what McDonald's is to food. It's the industrialization, commodification of a real human desire that is taken away from you and sold back at you and looks nothing like the original desire.
Do you agree that another thing that socially perhaps we should do is to not stigmatize the wrong people? That is, do not stigmatize the performers themselves, because
Totally.
as happens with people that we mentioned, Lena Rhodes, Mia Khalifa and others, they are the ones being stigmatized now. And even when they try to look for other jobs, I mean, sometimes after they've been in the porn industry, it's almost impossible for them to have a normal life afterwards.
That the women are stigmatized, why the men who make the porn and watch the porn are basically anonymous. We barely know them and they're certainly not stigmatized. So I would absolutely say it's crucial that we understand who the victims are here. And these are women, a lot of them are strong women. To withstand what they withstand in this, I think I would not last a day, given what's done to them. So also to understand that they need to organize. Now, I don't use the term sex work because it's not work. right, is sexual exploitation. And I think using the term sex work is a real disservice to these women because it denies the reality of their lives and what's happening to them. So I would say 100% you do not stigmatize them. And I think by using the word sex work, you are stigmatizing them even more because you are denying their reality.
So beyond regulation, would you be willing to consider abolishing porn, or do you not talk about that much because you think it's not realistic?
I don't think the word abolish or censor really fit in today's porn world about what we can do about it. I think, as I said, legislation, regulation, also what we need really good sex education in the schools. You know, the sex education taught in most countries is terrible. They barely teach about sex and what it's really like in relationships, and they certainly don't talk about pornography. And I think we need sex education that builds resilience and resistance to kids, and there need to be trained teachers. And it's interesting, studies done on kids and they ask about sex education, they all say it's out of touch with the reality of their lives. Doesn't mention pornography, doesn't mention what's happening to them. And at Culture Reframed, we have developed over a year using different consultants, a sex ed curriculum that is porn critical. It's free. Anyone can go on there. Just go to culturereframed.org, go on to our courses, and you will see we've got courses for parents and we've got courses for teachers and anyone else who wants to teach sex education. And it's very robust. It's been peer reviewed by people in the field. And I think it's one of the first ever robust sex education courses that brings in pornography. And it teaches critical literacy. That's what we do not teach. When you think that most kids spend their life on the internet, we should have courses in digital literacy, how to understand critical digital literacy, not how to become better consumers, but how to become more critical consumers of all the media that you consume. I mean, the schools have dropped the ball here totally on what it means for a kid to grow up surrounded by pornography.
Yes, and the very unfortunate thing here is that places, countries, or particular regions where sex education is banned or something along those lines. I mean, the places where children and adolescents will get their sex education from is pornography. Right.
Of course, where else? And it makes sense. You know, they start getting sexually curious when, you know, early adolescence, puberty hits. Where are they going to go when you've got this multi-billion-dollar industry up there? So the issue is not if your child sees pornography, it's when.
Yeah.
And so you have to start early scaffolding education about what critical literacy looks like. And then as they get older, you bring in pornography to it. So you can do that. It's possible to be done. People do it. But it must not be the only thing. What you need is to come at this in every which way. Regulation, education, awareness, all of these ways, you know, and to be honest with you, we're so far behind the porn industry in doing this. We are so far behind because you get slapped with labels like moralistic, religious, right-wing. So we've got to take this out of the realm of morals and into the realm of harm. And that's where we have the research that supports it. And that's where we have the academic approach to it. And also the feminist approach, of course.
Okay, so let me just ask you one final question. Do you think that there's something, I mean, apart from political approaches to all of this, that there's something that individual people, consumers, and so on can do to try to combat some of the more harmful effects of pornography?
Stop consuming pornography. Stop. There's no way to do this. You cannot consume images of women being, you know, violated in that way and make it easier. it's like asking, can you give me some more friendly images for racism? That racists like to look at racist images. So is there any way we can make better racist images? It's ridiculous. You can't do it. So I would, and for the men as well, I would say for their own sense of who they are, is this who they want to be? Masturbating, jerking off to images of sexual cruelty, of women who've had few choices in life? Is this who they really want to look in the mirror and say, this is who I am? Because when I often ask that question, a lot of them feel disgusted by themselves for using those images. So no, there's no way that I can make this easier by saying, go to this place or go to that place. You have to stop consuming it and become part of the battle against the porn industry and the sex industry in general. That's what we need. Basically, it's left up to a bunch of impoverished feminists to fight this, and increasingly some lawyers and other groups. But, men need to join this as well. This is not doing them any favors, pornography. And as they become fathers and have children, is this what they want their kids to grow up on?
Right.
That would be my final argument, is to stop consuming it. Because if you don't consume it, they won't make it.
And when it comes to resources, apart from your book, which I mentioned in the introduction, and your non-profit Culture Reframed, are there any other resources online or elsewhere that you would like to mention?
There's not much, to be honest with you. There's organisations in the UK, like CEASE is very good. The Reward Foundation is good. Also, if you go on our site, we've got lists of organisations you can go to. We've got resources. We also have an academic library on the Culture Reframed site, so you can read the studies. So I would say go to our website and you'll see the other resources. And if you're trying to get off pornography and want to stop, there's also an organisation called NoFap, which is a support group for men and boys to try and stop pornography. So yes, go on our website and you'll find resources.
Great. So, Dr. Dines, thank you so much for doing this. I will leave some links to all of what you mentioned there in the description of the interview, and it's been a very informative conversation. So thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.